So today we're just going to review everything that we've covered in the biological diversity unit, which is going to sound like a lot, but I'm going to run through it as best I can and just provide you the exact things that you need to know in order to be successful in this unit. Here we go. So first things first, we're going to run through the basics behind all the essential outcomes from the biological diversity unit today. I want much of your time today spent reviewing the concepts on your own, however. So in other words, I want you making your study guide or researching a little bit more about certain particular things that you need to maybe further your understanding on, or trying some of the textbook questions if you haven't finished them all already. Those sort of things are the things I want you looking at today. But anyway, the concepts in the biological diversity unit that are important are, of course, biological diversity, which is what we're going to start with. Then symbiotic relationships, that was commensalism, mutualism, parasitism. We're going to talk about niches again. It's been a long time since we've discussed that. We'll talk about predicting heritable traits using alleles. That was Punnett squares. We'll talk about asexual and sexual reproduction. We'll talk about genes, DNA, chromosomes, mitosis and meiosis, complete and incomplete dominance, extinction and extirpation, and natural versus artificial selection. And that's going to be in the order that we cover it today. That was also in the order that we learned those things. So those bottom about 4 or 5 things there, those should seem pretty fresh to you because we've just learned them. Anyway, let's move on. So first things first, just remember that with biological diversity, all living things can be connected underneath the classification system. It goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You don't have to memorize that order. It's just important to know that we can all be categorized in different, categories, right? So in other words, the more specific outcomes, or more specific, categories are of course down at the bottom. So genus and species are the 2 most specific ones, and the most general ones, so the ones that cover the most number of things, would be domain and kingdom, right? Now, genus and species are important because those 2 are the ones that we use to more or less scientifically, describe an organism, right? So under the Linnaean classification system, we only really use the genus and species to talk about an organism. So for instance, humans would be Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, and sapiens is the species. Anyway, moving on. All right, so identify the symbiotic relationship. I've chosen some new examples here. I just found some new pictures to throw in here. I want to see if you guys can do this. So if you want, just pause the video here and see if you can identify what relationship exists here. And hopefully you've already done it, but if you haven't, we'll go through it. I think I'll start with the one on the left here. What you're looking at is a tick in someone's arm, I'm guessing. It looks like they've got a watch on there. Well, a tick in someone's arm, that is a clear form of parasitism. Now, parasitism is where one benefits and one is harmed. This, of course, is harming a person. You can get things like Lyme disease from ticks and stuff like that, not to mention they kind of hurt, I think. But one way or another, that is parasitism. Next one I'll look at is this monarch butterfly on a flower. Now, the monarch butterfly, of course, is getting pollen from the flower, but the flower is also benefiting from this relationship because it's allowing its pollen to go get spread to other flowers, right? So since they're both benefiting from this, both of them are benefiting, it's a mutual relationship, therefore we call it mutualism. Okay, that one would be mutualism. Now, if you knew the third one, you could probably guess what this other one is. What you're looking at is a bird nest in a tree. Really, that was, I could have found a picture with the bird actually in the nest, I suppose, but hopefully you can still deduce that, this is a bird's nest in a tree. Now, the bird is benefiting from the tree because it's providing it shelter and somewhere to set up a nest. The tree, however, really doesn't care. The tree is not being harmed. It's also not being helped by having the nest here. So this is a classic example of commensalism. Commensalism is where one benefits and the other one does not care. All right, niches. Niches are the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem. So basically, it's just whatever part of the ecosystem that an organism occupies, right? There's some extreme examples, like this old picture I had of a dung beetle, right? Dung beetles actually roll like the feces of other animals around in balls and stuff like that, which is pretty gross, but also that's its one job and nothing else does that in its ecosystem. So it has that niche. So niches can include what it eats, what eats it, its habitat, nesting site, or range, its effect on populations around it, or its effect on the environments around it, right? Another thing to be really clear about is a niche can change throughout the lifetime of a species. One of the classic examples of that, of course, is a frog. When frogs start their life, of course, they're a tadpole swimming in a lake or a river or a pond, but then they grow up to become a frog, and the frog actually has a different niche, a different job in its ecosystem than a tadpole would, right? Put it this way, tadpoles aren't going around and eating flies with a long tongue, right? They have a different job, okay? All right, Punnett squares. We spent a long time on this. Punnett squares are used to predict the chances of offspring between two given parents having certain genetic characteristics. The whole idea here is, as a very blunt simplification, is different characteristics will have two alleles categorized to them, right? So in other words, for brown eyes, there's an allele for brown eyes, and there's also an allele for blue eyes. Brown, of course, is dominant over blue, so we write it with a capital letter. And if even one dominant trait is present, that dominant trait will show up in the phenotype, which in other words is what you actually see, right? So this person here has got a brown eye allele as well as a blue eye allele. And their spouse, of course, has the same genotype. So in other words, a brown eye allele and a blue eye allele. If you put it in a Punnett square, you basically just bring one down and one over. That forms this one. Then you bring this one down, this one over, right to here. It creates that. Then you bring this one over and this one down, makes that. Bring this one over and this one over, it makes that, right? The only way you can have blue eyes is if you had two blue eye alleles. We've talked again about how that's an oversimplification, but it is a good rule of thumb. It's a good way of predicting this, okay? All right, so we'll do an example. A heterozygous rose plant with large thorns, which is capital R, lowercase r, is crossed with a homozygous rose plant with small thorns, lowercase r, lowercase r. I'm gonna pause right there. What that means, of course, since small thorns is two lowercase r's, that tells us that small thorns are the recessive trait, okay? Draw a Punnett square, also lists the proportion of the offspring that will have which genotypes and phenotypes. All right, well, we'll draw the Punnett square first. Drawing a square, it just looks like a little window, 4 different boxes in it. Put one parent on the top, so I'll do capital R, lowercase r, and then lowercase r on the side. Bring them together, this is gonna be capital R, lowercase r, lowercase r, capital R, lowercase r, and lowercase r, right? So those would be the possible offspring that would result from the large thorn plant and the small thorn plant. Looking at it, we can see it's a 50% proportion. Half of them are capital R, lowercase r. That would be the genotype. And the phenotype of that, what you would actually see with those plants, because capital R is dominant and therefore it must be the large thorns, those two plants would have large thorns. And then the other 50%, because there's these two, are a genotype of lowercase r, which of course is small thorns. Good. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If you're still stuck on Punnett squares, reach out to me. Send me an email. Just say, hey, can you explain it again? I'm good. Anyway, let's move. So asexual reproduction is the next one. We just need to really know the advantages and disadvantages of both. I think we understand what asexual reproduction is. One thing I didn't throw in these slides are the different types of asexual reproduction. You might want to look into that as well. There was budding, there was binary fission, there was spore production, and there was one more. I think it was vegetative reproduction is the other one, right? But have a look through it. Make sure you understand the different forms of asexual reproduction. Some advantages of that is there's only one organism that's needed, right? So in other words, you can just do that whenever. It doesn't require any specialized cells to bring gametes together, which kind of implies that it uses less energy, and they can produce lots very quickly. Now, some disadvantages of asexual reproduction, they're actually very similar to the disadvantages of cloning, which we just talked about the other day. If conditions are unfavorable, the entire population could be wiped out. So in other words, any problems with the parent are going to be passed down to the child as well. So if there was a disease that the parent was susceptible to, the child is going to get it as well when asexual reproduction occurs. Now for sexual reproduction, of course, the main advantage, like I only list one because really it's such a huge advantage, it's really the only one worth noting. It provides a lot of genetic variation, which helps species survive environmental change. The genetic variation we're referring to here is, of course, the different kinds of genes that form up different organisms. Even within one species, there's tons of diversity, and that diversity actually provides protection to the entire population as a whole, because there's no single one thing, generally speaking, that could take out the entire population, okay? And that's because of sexual reproduction. It provides that genetic variation. Now, some disadvantages, of course, are 2 partners are needed, which makes it more difficult for endangered species. It's not a big deal for species where there's tons of members of the population, but again, for endangered species, that can make it quite challenging. It takes more energy, right? There's more energy that's involved in that, especially because there's specialized cells that have to be produced, and it only produces limited offspring, generally speaking. Certain species, you can disagree, that there's certain species that would have hundreds of offspring through this, but generally speaking, it's just a limited amount that gets formed. All right, genes, DNA, and chromosomes. This one, I just remember with all the formative things that we did, there was a lot of confusion as to what the order is. The order is from smallest to largest: genes, which are part of DNA, and then DNA are part of chromosomes, right? You have to understand that order. This picture here is another picture that really helps. This, of course, is a chromosome. It's formed up by bundles of DNA. DNA is like this double helix ladder looking thing. And then one little segment of DNA, that's a gene, right? So these genes are formed up by a bunch of base pairs. You don't need to know that, of course, but it's just a bunch of chemical base pairs that form up. And that pattern that forms is a code that's called a gene, right? So those genes are just parts of DNA, just a segment of DNA, okay? So chromosomes are packages of DNA that are found in the cell nucleus. Chromosomes are organized in pairs, with one chromosome being inherited from a mother and the other from a father. Humans have 46 chromosomes in total, which means there's 23 pairs, because 46 divided by 2 is 23, okay? Again, chromosomes exist in pairs. They kind of like form a buddy system kind of thing. So even though you have 46 chromosomes, they form in 23 pairs. And that's in every single cell nucleus, okay? Well, other than the gametes, which have half. Anyway, moving on. So in humans, if you have 2 X chromosomes, then that means you're female, right? So of these 46 chromosomes, 2 of them determine your gender, right? So one of them could be an X chromosome, and if the other one is also an X chromosome, you're female. Now, if you have 1 X chromosome and you have 1 Y chromosome, then that means you're male, right? So really what makes a difference is just that final chromosome. If it's X, like if you have a secondary X chromosome, you're female. If you have not a secondary X chromosome, you only have 1, but you have a Y chromosome instead, then that means you are male, right? Everybody has an X chromosome. Doesn't matter if you're male or female, but females have an extra X chromosome, whereas males have a Y chromosome instead. That's what determines the difference. All right, cell division, mitosis. This seemed to be pretty decent when I was doing those formatives. Mitosis occurs in the body cells for growth and repair. I could tell a lot of you like did some online research with this, because a lot of you were using some terminology that was like, whoa, I never even mentioned that. But that's good. Body cells, if you want a more technical word for that, it's somatic, okay? I don't expect you to know that. You don't need to know that somatic means body cells, but I saw a lot of people using that word. I was like, oh, whoa, holy smokes, you guys are like doing some research here. Somatic cells are body cells, right? Body cells are just an easier way of saying it, so that's why I stuck with that. Now, mitosis occurs for growth and repair, right? So in other words, even just natural repair like blood cells, right? Your blood cells will die every now and then, so they have to be repaired. That is done through mitosis, but also like literal repair. So if you got like cut, or something, right? And then of course your body has to repair that. Those cells don't just come out of nowhere, they come out of mitosis. It's a process where cells divide and reproduce and make new ones, right? Now this process uses binary fission to produce more cells. If you are connecting that term back to what we learned just a while ago about asexual reproduction, that means in your body right now, replicating at all times, your cells are actually doing asexual reproduction to produce more cells. That is mitosis, okay? That is a process of creating more cells. Now, in order for the cells to be identical, they must have the same DNA. The DNA must therefore be duplicated before the cell divides. That's important to understand. So before the cell divides, it copies its DNA, and once the DNA is all copied, it's got it all sorted, it splits into 2 new pieces, okay? Now, meiosis is a very similar process. You don't have to know the technical details. You don't have to know the exact pattern that it flows through. But what you really need to know about meiosis is that meiosis is used for forming the gametes, right? So for males, it would be for sperm. For females, it would be for eggs, right? Now, remember that 2 gametes join together to form a zygote. Therefore, half of your chromosomes come from your mother, half come from your father. If gametes have the full 46 chromosomes, that would mean a zygote would have 92, 46 times 2, right? We wouldn't want that. A human being needs to have 46 chromosomes in total. So bottom line is meiosis has to cut all of the chromosomes in half so that there's only 23, so that 23 get passed from a mother and 23 get passed from a father. So another thing to note is that meiosis involves 2 different cell divisions to make this happen. The cell divides once, and then each of those cells divide another time. So the product is 4 gametes from 1 initial cell. Okay, that's the whole idea. Next thing, incomplete dominance. This one hopefully wasn't too bad. It's just basically where some traits aren't totally dominant. In other words, it's not just like, oh, brown hair, blonde hair, oh, it's definitely gonna be brown hair, right? Well, for horses, if a horse has brown hair and a cross with a horse with white hair, that actually will show incomplete dominance, which means that the offspring won't just be brown or white, it'll be somewhere in between. It'll be like a tan kind of color, right? This is also very common in flowers. The most common flowers that do this, of course, are red flowers and white flowers. If a red flower crosses with a white flower, it produces pink flowers, at least for many plant species. It doesn't work for all of them, but it does happen for many. It's kind of like when, like, if you like washed your red shirt in the washing machine with a white shirt, then like you'll come out and you'll see that you get a bunch of like pink shirts. It's kind of the same idea there. I know it's kind of a silly example, but it's another way of thinking of it, right? All right, next up, causes of extinction and extirpation. Just a reminder that extirpation means an animal basically becomes locally extinct. It doesn't fully become extinct. It still exists other places. It just doesn't exist where it used to, right? That's what extirpation means. Some natural causes of this include fires, floods, volcanic eruptions, disease, over-specialization. That was one we talked about where it's like, that's kind of backwards, but it's true. Sometimes the needs of an animal gets too specific, and then when that need goes away, they can't survive anymore, right? Another one is lack of food due to overpopulation or interspecies competition. So in other words, if they're just like, basically just like outcompeted for the resources, that can produce extinction. Now a mass extinction, however, occurs over a relatively short period of time and usually is caused by a catastrophic event. Now relatively short period of time is really used quite loosely in biology and really just in the history of Earth. A relatively short period of time is pretty much just anything less than like 500,000 years, right? It's like, it's quite a long amount of time in terms of a human lifespan, but it still is, in terms of the Earth, a relatively short period of time. So an asteroid striking Earth is believed to have caused a mass extinction of dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. I'm sure we've all heard that one before. That's a very extreme mass extinction event, but still another one to talk about nonetheless. Human causes of mass extinction include habitat destruction, so things like deforestation or coral reef damage. Deforestation is kind of obvious, chopping down all the rainforests and stuff. Obviously, a lot of animals and plants are going to lose their natural habitat, which can cause extinction for species that were maybe more at risk. Coral reef damage, as we saw in this picture from before as well, is quite extensive. A lot of these corals only exist in certain regions, and if they're getting wiped out by rising ocean temperatures or by pollution, that can cause big problems, right? Now, another one could be an introduction of a non-native species. Humans can accidentally, or even sometimes purposely, bring non-native species into an area. I remember reading an example not too long ago, actually, and I didn't know this. In Antarctica, they actually ban dogs from being allowed there. You're not allowed to bring a dog to Antarctica. And apparently the reason is in the early expeditions to Antarctica, people would bring dogs and they'd kind of just let them loose. And then the dogs, of course, just being bored or hungry or some combination of the two, would actually go and they'd kill the penguins that are there. Like, I know it sounds like a joke, but like I read that the other day and I was like, oh, whoa, wow. You definitely double check and just fact check it just to make sure it's true. But apparently because the penguins were being basically eaten by the dogs, they said no more dogs. We don't want dogs eating all the penguins there, because penguins really don't have a natural fear of a lot of things. Penguins, at least most penguin species, aren't afraid of humans, right? You can walk right up to them. But anyway, moving on. So overhunting is another obvious one. That happened with the buffalo here in Alberta. Not a huge surprise, of course. That's part of a lot of social studies classes where the introduction of European weapons in particular were able to kill off a ton of buffalo with very little energy, right? So overhunting really killed off those as a whole species. Next up, natural selection. This is really important for you to understand. This is just where nature selects the traits that continue to be passed on from one generation to the next, right? So in other words, basically, if you wanted to sum up natural selection, you could say it's survival of the fittest. It's just basically just whatever is the most likely to survive is the most likely to pass on their genes. One little example that I found, of course, where let's say there was tan color mice and there was like black mice. Of course, if they're in an area that has a dark surface, the lighter color mice are going to be less likely to survive, right? Because they're going to be more likely to be spotted by predators. That's just one example, right? There's several different examples of natural selection, of course, but that's just one of them. Artificial selection. This is where humans select the traits that get passed on to future generations. You will need to understand the main types of artificial selection. There's several different ways that humans have managed to do this. The most common way by far is selective breeding, right? So in other words, purposely selecting what plants or animals breed with certain other ones to get the certain traits that we want. Dog breeding was an obvious one, right? Dogs are all descended from wolves. Over generations and generations and generations of selective breeding, we've managed to produce all the dog breeds we know today. Another one, of course, is with crops. Crops are actually selectively breeded as well to produce crops that have the benefits and the traits that we want them to have. So that's done by selective breeding as well. Cloning is an extreme example, of course, but it is, again, another example of artificial selection. Artificial insemination, which is what they often do with livestock, that's another one that's kind of related to selective breeding. In vitro fertilization, that's just basically where you take the genetic material and you make it fertilize in like a little petri dish, like in this picture right here. They actually do this with people sometimes too. It's a relatively new technology. It's only been around for a couple decades, but it really helps out couples, especially that are having trouble having a child on their own, because this can be a lot more precise. Genetic engineering is the last one. We do this with plants in particular. That's where we take certain genes and actually edit them into the genetic code of other things and then have them grow. There's a lot of controversy about that. There's some people that just really aren't comfortable with that as an idea. But again, science has shown the benefits are really quite heavy, right? In other words, that we've been able to produce a lot more crop through genetic engineering than we would have been with just plain old selective breeding or just using natural plants, right? So what are some benefits of this? What are some risks? Well, some benefits of this, of course, I'm not even going to write it down. You get the traits you want, right? So the benefits of this are you can isolate exactly what traits you want, and you can get that from there. Now, with in vitro fertilization for humans, of course, you're not looking at traits. You're literally just looking for having the fertilization become possible, right? But with other things, of course, we're just looking to isolate the traits. What are some risks? Well, some risks are, of course, for some of these, there can actually be some problems that form. Genetic engineering is one of them, of course. If you don't do it correctly, you're going to produce offspring that just don't work. They're just not viable. But some other risks, of course, are if you're selectively breeding a certain trait over and over and over again, if there's any problem with that trait, that problem is going to be passed on as well. So you got to be really careful when you're doing this to make sure that the traits you're selecting don't actually have any unforeseen negative consequences. All right, we're done. So for practice, just letting you know right now, page 80 has a really awesome summary of every concept in this unit. You can have a look through it. If there's no questions on it or anything like that, there's some questions a few pages after there that you can kind of poke through if you wish. Otherwise, you could use some of the practice questions from previously in this unit, or at least flip through them. Yeah, that's basically bottom line all you need to do. But the most important thing for you to do, if you haven't already completed it, because this is, of course, the Wednesday lesson, the Tuesday lesson was to complete a study guide project from, for the whole unit and upload it to the Google Classroom stream page, right? So this is right next to the classwork page. We don't really use the stream much. I was just thinking, you know what, let's try to use it right now. Let's just try something new. Upload your study guide project to that page and then comment on at least one other person's study guide. Just say something like, hey, I really like what you included about Punnett squares. Or, hey, you found some information in there that I didn't know that actually helped me out. Just like a little comment like that. It could only be like one sentence long. That's all you need to say. Just something you found interesting from it. And the reason I'm getting you to do that, in case you're wondering, and let's be honest here, it's not going to take you like 2 seconds, so don't complain about it. But the reason I'm getting you to do it is so that you can see some other people's perspectives on this, so you can get a little bit more information. And if there's something in their study guide that you really like, then write it down, right? Because these study guides are going to be absolutely critical for that unit exam that we're going to have, which of course is opening today, Wednesday, May 6th, and it must be completed by the end of Thursday. Now, just so you know about this unit exam, of course, grades are being kept in Google Classroom, at least for now. Now, I'm recording this, I'm like full disclosure, I'm recording this on Wednesday, April 29th. So things could have actually changed by Wednesday, May 6th. Again, the grades stay in Google Classroom for now. The grades that you already had in PowerSchool are going to stay put for now. There might be some plan to merge them at some point. Stay tuned. We don't actually know yet what the plan is for that, at least not for junior high. For senior high, it's full send ahead. We've been doing grades, everything, the whole 9 yards. But I am still giving this assessment, of course, the biological diversity unit exam, just to make sure we're understanding these concepts going forward. And I will store the grade in Google Classroom for you to reflect on and see what you got. Anyway, your work's cut out for you. I'm going to stop blabbering. If you have any questions, please let me know. I am here to help at any time. Send me an email, comment on Google Classroom, whatever you need. I will be there. Anyway, best of luck, guys, and best of luck on that exam tomorrow.